Christianity has a dirty little secret. And do you know what it is? Actually, probably has a lot of dirty little secrets. But one of the ones I want to talk about today is the dirty little secret that a lot of pastors, ministers, etc. lose their faith when they go to seminary. And I want to talk a little bit about why this is. And I think part of this is prompted due to a lot of comments that I've gotten on my channel geared at my education, because I often start videos by saying I have a Master of Divinity, which is the formal degree you get to go be a minister. I have a Master of Arts in Theology that I did after that, and I have a PhD in Christian Origins. So by the way, this is a good spot to say, if you haven't already done so, do subscribe. But what happens is I get so many comments from people who are like, all that education and you still don't know the truth, or, you know, you have a PhD, but you don't believe the Bible, or you don't believe the truth. You don't believe what I believe. And I think it's ironic as I think about the process of educating people and what education is actually for. I've thought a lot about this. I think it's one of the most interesting things in Christianity that we don't really talk about, that when people are in churches, the leaders who go to get trained to lead those churches often find themselves in a position where they have to leave. That's wild. Like, stop and think about that. Think about the fact that somebody will go off to seminary and end up completely leaving the religion instead of coming back and leading the community they had intended to lead. And I think from the other side, like for somebody who doesn't know what's happening in that seminary, you kind of make up stories. And the two most common stories that I hear is that you somehow got tricked by liberal professors. This is really common, that like you went and listened to liberals and got totally tricked, and that's why you now believe liberal things and why you're not a Christian anymore. And I think this is just an incredibly stupid argument. Like, if you actually believe that somebody will have a career in mind, feel like they are called by God, go off to seminary and just be susceptible to brainwashing after all of that call and all of that like excitement they had for doing the calling, they picked a career, they went off and got brainwashed by professors. Like, that's stupid. If you want to believe that, you can, but that's ridiculous. That's absolutely ridiculous. A lot of people fall back on the trustworthy old, well, they were never really saved, they were never really Christian. This also seems kind of stupid. I mean, I don't really know why people are so obsessed with saying this. Well, okay, actually I do, because instead of saying they went off to seminary and learned something so damaging to their faith or their beliefs that they couldn't in good conscience come back and lead us, I'm still in this community if I'm this person. So it's easier to say, well, they were never really one of us to begin with. And then all of this conversation goes along with this idea that biblical scholars are biased, because I see this a lot too. And it's, you know, in my comments, maybe I should stop reading the comments, but I like reading comments. But I see a lot of people say like, well, biblical scholars are biased against the truth, that like you somehow have this, again, often liberal, but like Bible scholars don't actually believe the truth. They're just out to get you. When I was a teenager, the movie God's Not Dead came out, and it sort of, I think, serves as a really important commentary on what evangelicals think about education. They think that you go in and an atheist philosophy professor is out to get you and destroy your faith, probably because they are angry at God. Maybe God did something. They're mad at God. And they just have all these unworked father figure resentment issues with God, and they need to work through that, and maybe they get saved at the end. I think it's a really oversimplistic movie and parable, but I think it is a true expression of a certain type of way that a certain type of Christian thinks about education. And it's worth stopping to think about this, not just because people leave the faith or would-be Christian leaders leave the faith, which is an important question. Let's put a pin in that for a minute. But probably the big question that comes from all this is, why does a certain type of conservative evangelicalism see itself as fundamentally at war with education? And you see this in, you know, famous like people trying to get school boards to teach creationism alongside of evolution. You see it in the assault of biblical criticism or good history that apologists launch. You see it as this sort of battle of worldviews that a lot of people think they are in between Christian apologists and atheists, secular humanists, postmodernists, relativists, fill in the blank with your favorite category of evil person that a conservative Christian often thinks they are out to war against, to fight against. But I think one of the simplest ways to understand this is that conservative evangelicalism, I use the word fundamentalism, I know these are problematic terms, but I think one of the easiest ways to understand this is that these movements are fundamentally pushbacks to modernity. These movements emerged in the 20th century as a pushback to modernity, as a pushback to education. Fundamentalism is a pushback to this. And I've often said that when you look at the birth of what was happening in churches in Germany, especially, and in the end of the 19th century, and in the universities in Germany, you were seeing a lot of higher criticism. You were seeing people look at the Bible and say, like, we have thousands of manuscripts. They contradict each other. How can we use science to get back to the original manuscripts? This is, even secular scholars now will say this is problematic in today's day and age, but this was what people were thinking about. Or they might say of the historical Jesus that this is the Jesus of faith. We've inherited what's called the Christ of faith, which is a Christ who is mediated by the church. So how can we actually get back to who the historical Jesus would have been, what the historical Jesus would have been teaching as a first century Jew in Palestine? Again, very problematic now for historians, but this is the type of work they were trying to do. And as a result, American Christianity pushed back, and we saw like this snowball into the 20th century of this movement that was very anti-intellectual, very at its core, fighting against that, believing that the very act of asking these types of questions was in itself an assault on Christianity. And at this point in time, there were sort of two different paths I think that Christianity could have taken. The one is the conservative evangelical path, where we bury our heads in the sand and push back against modernity and pretend that all of the things we believed in the dark ages should stay true, and that if we can just get back to the Bible as this magical book that we can just understand, and God has everything in it, it's the final word, and it's the pushback against science, it's the pushback against any kind of political question, any kind of legal question, that the Bible has all the answers. Or we could have taken another approach. We could have taken the approach to say, okay, we recognize that a lot of Christianity was formed in a very different time than we have now. We recognize that these people wrote down these things and they're potentially imperfect, but it was how they understood the world. We recognize that there's a cultural background or a literary background behind the New Testament or the works of the Bible in general, and that we can critically and openly engage with the faith and still kind of stay connected to it, but ask a lot of hard questions. I think those are the two types of visions that you could have had for Christianity at the turn of the 20th century. But in Germany, you had World War II, you had the Holocaust, you had the rise of Hitler, you had all of these terrible things, and even biblical studies has its own terrible legacy of how it got caught up in the Nazi world, because like I often say, so much, I will say before, like in the late 19th century, a lot of good biblical criticism was coming out of German universities, but then a lot of these people got wrapped up in the Nazi party, or at the very least had to like deal with what was happening there. And it changed the face of history. For a lot of different complicated historical reasons, the Christianity that many, many people inherited, especially in an American context, and I'm not even American, you might think from my accent that I am. Sometimes I drop in the occasional A or a boot, which should tell you I'm Canadian. But even I grew up in the echoes of this type of American evangelicalism, which was very anti-intellectual. I've often said, like, I grew up reading apologists and thinking I was doing intellectual work. I never took a science class after grade 10 because I believed I was being persecuted by being taught evolution. Some of the stuff is ridiculous, but it's the reality of how I viewed the world as an evangelical. So how does this come back to seminary, and why do so many people lose their faith in seminary? Well, if you have conservative evangelicalism as a movement that is fundamentally anti-intellectual, fundamentally built on a pushback to historical critical study of the Bible, on a pushback to quote unquote liberal, and I mean small L liberal here, not big L liberal, but you have this movement that was a Christian movement built on being anti-education, being anti-intellectual, and you have people going to seminary, and what are they going to do? They're going to learn Greek and Hebrew, and they're going to look at texts and realize the same things that the German biblical scholars in the late 19th century realized. Holy crap, there are a lot of different manuscripts. We don't know which one's accurate. Holy crap, early Christians read other things as scripture beside the things that are in our New Testament. Holy crap, this Greek word doesn't mean what I think it means, or the writings of Paul that I thought were just really, really clear when I read them in King James Version English are actually much more complicated, or the figure of Jesus is more complicated than I thought, or the Gospels seem to have a literary relationship to each other. They're copying each other. Why is that? And how can they be eyewitness accounts if they're copying each other? The problem is when you're looking at religious practice, of evangelical conservative religious practice, it's very easy to stick your head in the sand and pretend that what you're doing is true. It's easy to pretend that the things you believe are true, like the Bible is the inerrant word of God. And when you have apologists working really hard to help people stay diluted to help keep people dedicated to maintaining this lie without actually saying, like, look, the emperor has no clothes, people in the pews don't ever realize the serious problems with their tradition or with the way they've been taught to view the world. But when you have somebody going to study Christian history or manuscript history, getting background in like critical thinking about texts and looking at manuscripts, looking at variations, looking at how doctrine emerged, looking at the history of the church, it doesn't take a liberal professor to trick you into questioning the things you believed, because all it takes is looking at the evidence. You just look at the evidence and realize the things you believe are wrong. And you realize that the sad little ways that the apologists gave you to protect your little box of faith fall flat. You realize, as I realized, that my apologist heroes never actually took the time to do any serious study. It doesn't take a liberal professor tricking you for you to question faith in seminary. It just takes an honest, open look at the Christian tradition to realize that it is more complicated than anything that I was ever given. And the wild thing is, the thing that just drives me bonkers is that most of these people, instead of going back to their communities and being like, we need to talk because this is more complex than we ever realized. There is space for this in some communities, but not the communities I grew up in. You're just ostracized. You're like, I don't believe the right things anymore, so I have to leave. So the communities keep their head in the sand. They get the leaders that are willing to either toe the line, or the leaders who don't have proper education or haven't asked the right questions or whatever. They will get leaders who uphold their very oversimplistic, dumb view of the Bible, the world, etc., because they self-select those leaders to fit with their biases. And the people who have actually looked at the complexity of the Christian tradition and understood there are problems don't get to stay. They end up usually having to leave, or they end up in more mainline progressive denominations. This is the dirty secret of Christianity. But here's where the chickens are coming home to roost. Is that the right expression? I think it's chickens that come home to roost. Because what you have now is a movement that we are calling deconstruction. And the thing is that the knowledge that used to be locked in seminaries and locked in the ivory tower is now widely available on the internet. It's literally everywhere. So that people can watch a video and understand the synoptic problem, for example, that they probably wouldn't have heard about otherwise. They can watch a video and understand the development of theology, or they can understand something about why maybe the specifics of their denomination that their denomination thinks is the hill you have to die on, like a pre-trib or post-trib or some stupid thing like that. They can understand that this is either not the only way of looking at it, or it's outright wrong. And they can start to realize there's a lot more to the world that I was ever taught. You have a generation of kids whose parents and Christian leaders are giving them this box and saying, this is the box you have to live in. And in the meantime, they're going to school and being like, I have friends who are different religions. How do I think about that? I have friends who are gay. How do I think about that? Or I can go on YouTube and Google and realize that the things that I was taught are just really oversimplistic. And I believe that this is the wave of deconstructionism that we are seeing today, because the process that used to happen in seminaries is now happening whole scale in the evangelical fundamentalist churches. And churches are freaking out. They are concerned because all of their young people are being brainwashed, or they're being led astray, or fill in the blanks. It's an attack on the church by Satan. But really all it is it's this process that used to happen behind closed doors in an ivory tower for seminarians who just went away and didn't say anything about it. And all of a sudden it's happening to your kids in your churches, because they can look for themselves at primary evidence. They can look at a manuscript like Codex Sinaiticus, I have it here, where I talk about it, and realize there are different books in the earliest full copy of the Bible we have. The New Testament doesn't even have the same books in it. How do you deal with that? We have a world where people can actually ask intelligent questions and get really good answers that just aren't the cookie cutter answers they used to get from a pastor or from an apologist. And what's really pathetic, this is what really gets me as a former evangelical fundamentalist, is that those churches will say you have to leave, or the young people will say I have to leave. I don't believe the right things, therefore I must be an atheist. Therefore I'm, an agnostic. Therefore I can't be in this community anymore. And the stupid thing is that community was always bound to fail anyways, because it's based on an oversimplistic way of looking at the world that's not true. I've pointed these out in other videos, but the belief that the Bible is the inerrant word of God, patently false if you're willing to look at the history and realize that it's an impossible belief for the first 200 years of Christianity, 300 years of Christianity. Even later, it's not something that ever made any sense. It's a modern belief. Believing that Jesus Christ died on the cross for my sins to pay a blood sacrifice to a deity who apparently is metaphysical and all-knowing and all-powerful and all-loving, but couldn't actually forgive me for my sins? Who wants to keep having that type of oversimplistic view of the world when you look at Christian history and realize that this isn't always what people have believed? This is a relatively recent, in terms of Christian history, it's a relatively recent belief. So what's the answer? There's one of two things. Either those young people, just like a lot of seminarians do, are going to disappear and they're going to say, I just want nothing to do with Christianity because it's stupid. Or they're going to self-select out and they're going to not talk to people about it. They're going to go, maybe worst case scenario, they'll go on the internet and complain about it and be mad about it. Or what if we reimagined a Christian community that you could belong to, not because you believe the right things or you have this oversimplistic box of doctrines that we can all nod along to and everybody believes the exact same things, or you recognize that just as it has throughout history, Christianity has always been evolving. The doctrines have always been evolving. The things Christians believe have always been evolving. They're historically conditioned. The Bible is a book that has always been evolving, is copied, is historically conditioned. We get to decide which books are in and which books are out. And if we recognize that we could reimagine new ways to belong to Christianity, to connect to Christianity without having a checklist of doctrines we expect people to hold. And if we recognize that using our brain, education, exploring could actually be a really fantastic, almost like I'm going to say spiritual practice, but it could be something really, really amazing that young people, old people, anybody gets to do because we have all this wonderful information at our fingertips. I find this every week. I'm on YouTube watching these YouTubers because I'm learning so much about the Bible, about church history, things I didn't know either. We can all learn together. It's an incredible way to explore and experience a tradition, not because we all believe the right things and have checked the right boxes, but because we are actually interested in the tradition. And even in that exploration, a lot of us are experiencing a way of belonging that matters to us and is meaningful to us. And the dirty little secret that Christian communities have, that their leaders go off and get educated and feel like they can't lead anymore, doesn't actually have to be the case. We could actually look to the people who have gone away and kept their mouths shut about the problems they found within the tradition and bring them into the conversation and have a much wider conversation about what Christianity is, what we know to be true, what we know not to be true, and how we want to keep practicing this tradition that is meaningful to us. There will always be people who want to stick their head in the sand. There will always be people who are wired like fundamentalists. Even if you don't belong in a fundamentalist church, if you don't go to a fundamentalist church, there are always people who are confident and even cocky about their own narrow little worldview, and they don't even know what they don't know. And you can't really do much about that. But you can find people to be in community with who are open and interested and willing to ask questions and willing to let you experience doubts. And I hope for you and for me that that's actually what the future of Christianity holds, because I would love a Christianity that can actually look openly at the world and try to understand things and have a genuine curiosity for all things, including Christian history. And I would like to see a lot less of those Christians that are trying to cram everyone else into their tiny fundamentalist boxes, arrogantly thinking that they have the truth, even when there are holes in their own logic and their thinking a mile wide that anybody else can see. So the real question is, if people go to seminary and lose their faith, was it ever a faith worth having? Or could we imagine a faith that's bigger than the seminary experience, a faith that's big enough that you wouldn't have to lose it by asking questions? That is my dream for the future of Christianity. That's my dream for a lot of wonderful mainline denominations, open churches that are doing great things and willing to let people ask questions. Keep going. If you're in a church like that, if you're running a church like that, I love it. And I will see you next time.